Just wanted to- you got it. Okay. Good afternoon, distinguished guests and panelists. I am Dr. Sheila Caldwell, Southern Illinois University System Office Vice President of Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Chief Diversity Officer. I would like to welcome you as we begin our second conversation, which is part of a 6-part series highlighting narrative themes from our 2022 Viewfinder Campus Climate Survey. Just as a reminder, session 1 was focused on diversity and racial battle fatigue, and you can actually find that on our SIU YouTube channel if you would like to review that. Today, we will focus on the myth of the most qualified applicant. Again, many narrative findings in our Viewfinder Campus Climate Survey. And I'm going to quickly introduce the third session, which will take place on November 16th, and we're going to speak to free speech and diversity of thought. It will feature Michelle Dutchman, who serves as the inaugural executive director for the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. So I encourage you all to tune in on November 16th at 12 o'clock for our third series in this discussion. Our remaining sessions will take place in February, March, and April of 2023. But again, back to today, part 2, we will focus on the myth of the most qualified applicant. And to join us for this necessary and crucial conversation, I have presenting alongside me SIU System President, Dr. Dan Mahoney, SIU Edwardsville Provost, Dr. Denise Cobb, SIU Carbondale Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Dr. Paul Frazier, and also our resident expert in value add from School of Medicine, Ms. Teresa Price. She serves as our Executive Director of Human Resources. I also wanted to introduce to those of you who may not have had the opportunity to review Ms. Doris Williams. She serves as our System Office Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Project Coordinator. And she will facilitate questions from our attendees today. So again, I want to thank all of our attendees and audience who has joined today. And I would encourage you to submit your questions through the chat or to actually submit them directly to Doris Williams at doris.williams@siu.edu. Now, before we dive into our conversation and hear from our experts of panel members, I am going to share data about why this topic emerged as a finding from our campus climate survey. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to actually read direct quotes from our presentation from the findings today. Forgive me for that. We just talked about technical difficulties. All right. For some reason the screen is here we go. Okay, I just wanted to obviously mention again what was the purpose of the campus climate survey that we all partake in this past March of 2022. And we wanted to assess the perceptions of faculty, staff, and students, evaluate resources within the community and on our college campuses, and analyze experiences as it related to bias incidents, as it related to harassment, as it related to sense of belonging, anti-racism, as well as welcome. Now, what we did in that particular survey, we sent it out to 20,000 students and 7,000 employees. And we got a 52% response rate from our employees, including our faculty, staff, and administrators. And we got about a 20% response rate from our students. And when we looked at the qualitative data, we found that these were the emerging themes and patterns from the data. There was an experience of feelings of diversity fatigue, again, what we just addressed in our previous conversation of understanding. There were also concerns about bias and fairness in the hiring and promotion process, which brings us here today to discuss the myth of the most qualified applicant. We're going to also speak to lack of belonging, bias, and race, lack of appreciation for work, and inadequate salary and benefits. Those are the themes that you can expect to hear as we continue these dialogues. But as we specifically looked at comments about our hiring process, I want you all to walk with me as I share direct quotes, again, from faculty, students, and administrators. The first comment, we need to hire faculty with the best ability to educate the students we have. So hiring should be based on the most professional quality of the hire, not based on color. Sometimes we cannot have both. The consideration for diversity often outweighs the need to hire competent employees. There needs to be more diverse hiring. There are a lot of staff and faculty that know each other personally before getting hired, but we need to take the time to look outside of that. The next comment, hiring practices should be based on qualifications, experience, training, or education, and not by race or to meet a certain quota. Hire employees based on the ability to perform the job and not on race. African American and LGBTQIA employees are more likely to be promoted and hired over white employees. Prioritize the recruitment of Hispanic students from Illinois and Hispanic faculty, not only African American students and faculty. I want to share more comments, again, so we can understand the depth of some of the concerns. And really quickly, I'm trying to make sure that my screen will allow me to actually see all of the narrative here. There needs to be more representation of different races and cultures involved in the hiring processes. Stop worrying about getting the best diverse person for positions and just look for the best person, period. I have been involved in hiring and told to strongly consider people of diverse cultures and gender when selecting finalists. We want SIU to be the strongest university in system, and being told to overlook the most qualified person because they do not fit diversity is a bad policy for us to use. Administration would benefit from more diversity training and how to implement it, specifically implicit bias. Administration could also use training when it comes to valuing a person of color compared to tokenizing them. There needs to be more standardization of the way job searches are conducted. Every department is doing it differently, and there are no set plans to increase diversity. The only standard seems to be that search committees, which may have diverse members, are only advisory to senior administrators who may overrule committees and are generally cisgender white males here. So diversity on search committees doesn't have teeth. Diversity training needs to be for everyone and more engaging than a webinar. Require departments to attend diversity workshops and at least plan for increasing diversity and approve additional positions to make new hires possible. Let us talk about the retention of women and Hispanics in my department since I joined. In 13 years, I have seen 4 faculty women, 1 international scholar, and 2 Hispanic faculty leave us. When these individuals find positions elsewhere, the administration makes it a point of not offering a counter offer. And again, except in the last case, which she presented her resignation 2 weeks before leaving. What does this tell me? It tells me that they do not want us. I'm gonna read a few more comments. Faculty of color are overburdened by committee work. We represent diversity, but there are so few of us, we end up serving on a disproportionately large number of committees compared to white colleagues. I feel as a white male at SIUE, we are made out to be the enemy. I feel that SIU makes it clear that anytime there's a job opening that they are looking for diverse candidates and not white males. Almost to the point that if you are a white male, you might as well count yourself out because you know they are going to give the job to a diverse candidate and not you, even if you are the most qualified. I feel SIU worries more about their appearance of looking diversity friendly in the community over picking the best candidate. And I feel that the SIUE has suffered as a whole because of this. The last comment, tokenism. The administration at all levels are good on using big words to fill positions with people of color and women, but they do very little to assist these individuals at succeeding at their job. They do not receive the same salary as white faculty do, and they have the same expectations as a white male, and they are not given enough support, including child support for families. So really quickly, before we listen and learn from Dr. Mahoney as he gives us very precise quantitative data, I want to share, because we talk about some of the myths. And one of the resonating features and comments, as you all heard, that because there is an increase of diversity hiring, that somehow the college is overlooking more qualified people. But one of the things that I would like to share that is deeply rooted in the research is similar to me bias. The similar to me effect is a cognitive bias that explains our tendency to prefer people that look and think like us. We have an affinity towards all things familiar to us, which is why the similar to me effect is also known as the affinity bias. While it might seem harmless in principle to associate ourselves with familiar people, the similar to me effect can lead to unjust consequences when applied to hiring practices, workplace promotions, and tolerance towards others. Dr. Iris Bonet, author of What Works, Gender Inclusivity by Design. She is also the dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. And she says in her book, like people in most other human endeavors, hiring managers are powerfully and often unwittingly influenced by their biases. While it's exceedingly difficult to remove bias from an individual, it's possible to design organizations in ways that make it harder for biased minds to skew judgment. We should stop wasting resources trying to de-bias mindsets and instead start to de-bias our hiring procedures. And so some of the recommendations, again, that's rooted in high impact hiring practices is that the sense of belonging starts with the job ad. So we should think about inclusive job ads when we're inviting candidates from all different backgrounds to apply so we can get the most qualified applicants. Gender Decoder app, we're going to hear data about where we stand with gender. Carl Matfield's work. You put in a job ad and it will let you know if the job ad is masculine coded or if it's feminine coded. And the data shows that if it's a masculine coded job ad, that you will reduce or that you can reduce the number of equivalent applicants.
Decoder app.
Then we have structured interview, which are much better than structured
language that will let you know if you're written.
Sorry. If we can all mute as panelists, sorry. I could hear feedback. Structured interviews is another strategy, and comparative evaluations. Again, we want to compare apples to apples. How did candidate 1 answer question 1 compared to candidate 2, compared to candidate 3? We want to make sure that we're having integrity and we're doing comparative evaluations in our process. Again, this is what the data shows as far as how to overcome bias in the interview process. And so now I'm going to stop sharing, and I have one video, as I've given all of these different examples with the research. I have one video and it's about 1 minute that I think is worth sharing today. And so that was a video that went viral, but I actually wanted to share that because we actually talk oftentimes in generalities about how does bias show up in the interview process. But I just wanted to quickly show that video. The gentleman says he went from Jose to Joe, and within a matter of 7 days, he did not alter anything on his resume. He called the exact same company that he called prior to removing the S from his name or dropping the S, and he was getting callbacks, and he was actually hired a week later. Because again, there was bias when someone read Jose on an application compared to the name Joe. So similar to me, bias definitely had an effect on him. Joe, more European, Jose, Latinx, Latino name did not yield the exact same results. Harvard, University of Chicago, and Stanford, they have actually been able to show that if you are a job applicant with an ethnic sounding name, that you are 50% less likely to get a call back than someone that has more of a European sounding name. Other myths that also consume the job market. Sometimes we assume that when people of color come, that they may not stay long. And sometimes those are some of the decisions that are made in the job hiring process. We also talk about a leaky pipeline. That's another myth, that there are not people who are available who cannot fill those particular positions. But these are some of the things that we're going to discuss today as we talk about the myth of the most qualified applicant. And I'm very excited to now introduce to you SIU System President, Dr. Mahoney, and he's actually going to share data directly from SIU campuses that really speak to where exactly are we in the hiring process as we look at racial and gender composition in leadership. So Dr. Mahoney.
Yeah, and some of this came, I think, from the comments we had in the campus climate survey, and it was particularly interesting to me, some of those comments that said, for example, that white candidates had no chance to get the jobs, and particularly white males had no chance for jobs. And so I started to look at what we've done from a hiring perspective over the last few years, as well as the makeup of our leadership, really looking primarily at those who are direct reports to the chancellors, as well as those who are deans. So kind of looking at that as the criteria. And again, we could choose different criteria, but this at least gave us some place to start. And just to give you some perspective of what we're comparing it to, at this point, if you look at our student population, we're about 53% white nationally and about 47% students of color. So that gives you some perspective of what the student bodies look like across the country. 60% are female at colleges and universities today, 40% male. If we look at the population in general, not just looking at higher ed students, it's about 40% people of color and about 51% female. So when you think about the numbers we have, you have to compare them back to both the student population and the general population numbers. So if we look at our campus leadership, and again, that's kind of senior level leadership and deans, we're about 70.7% white on the campuses. So again, exceeds both the national averages for students as well as the population. About 9.8% Asian and 19.5% African American, and 58.5% are white males. If we look at hires I looked at the last 3 years in particular. So again, has there been a change? Because that's what we heard a little bit, I think, in the campus climate surveys, things have changed. And again, it's white males don't have a chance anymore. Well, if we look at the last 3 years, 64.3% of the candidates hired for their senior level positions were white, 10.7% were Asian, and 25% were African American. So we do see a little bit of a change, an increase both in the Asian and African Americans, but the white population of new hires is still 64.3%. So again, exceeds the national population as well as the student body. 50% of the new hires were white males. So again, that perspective and that comment we just heard that white males have no chance, clearly that is not at all what's happening and not the case. We also had a specific question on gender. And if you guess that 50% were white male, we can pretty much guess we're not hitting the 51% female in hires or in the overall leadership. And that's certainly the case. We're about 25% of the people in those senior leadership positions are women. Hiring over the last 3 years has not changed that. It's been almost identical to that. So we haven't seen any real change in increasing women and hiring of women, which again, I think we'll get to in the discussion and some of the reasons why that may be the case and some of the things I think we can do better on. I will say there's, again, a couple of places we've done a little better at the system level. We've actually had 3 hires, 2 of which have been women and 2 of which have been people of color. So we've done a little bit better as far as particularly hiring of women at that level. School of Medicine is a particularly interesting one if you dig down. And I think if we did this for other colleges and units, we might find some differences. But in the senior leadership in the School of Medicine, 53% are female. So that's pretty close to that national average for the population. It's a little below the student average. But again, that's a little bit different than we're seeing across at the levels I was looking at. So that was not included in that other data set. So clearly we have seen, I think the conclusion is a few things. We have seen some changes, but we have not certainly seen anything that would indicate that white candidates or particularly white male candidates are disadvantaged and have no chance to get jobs. Quite the opposite. They're still getting jobs higher than their percentage in the population. We have a long way to go on gender. And that's one that I think we, again, need to probably dive into in the discussion. But that's just a start. I don't know if, Sheila, there's any follow-up questions at this point, or we'll go into the other questions.
I don't know, we can go into the other questions. Thank you so much for highlighting that data, because again, our goal was to make sure that even though we have these comments, that we share where we stand as a system across our campuses. One of the things I would like to do before we ask our expert panel members questions is I want to make sure, even as you've listened to the specific comments I shared from the Viewfinder Campus Climate Survey, as well as Dr. Mahoney, please feel free to send any questions to Ms. Doris Williams, again at doris.williams@siu.edu, as well as put questions in the YouTube chat, because we definitely want to respond to those questions. And we will have about 30 minutes to respond to any questions you have for us at that time. And so again, thank you for joining us today. And now the first question to our panelists. Provost Cobb, if you could share what makes a successful search in the faculty. And if you can actually talk about the needs of your hiring process, how do you rate candidates, and how does SIU mission and culture fit into selecting the best and most qualified applicants?
Well, searches are among the most important things that we do. When you look at academic budgets, just as an example, I've spent a lot of time looking at academic budgets lately, and you see that, you know, more than 90% of the budget is focused on personnel. And so each and every search is really critical to fulfilling our mission. And I don't always know exactly who the right candidate will be, but I'm really focused on process, right? That's my focus, and the accountability around process is part of my responsibility, and having the deans take a leadership role in making sure that we are doing all that we can to support our institutional goals. So each and every search to me has to begin by having a committee that's well-trained. I just think the assumption that everyone knows how to conduct a search well doesn't fit with what we know from best practices across the literature, right? There are ways that we have to develop processes and protocols that will help us mitigate our own tendencies toward implicit bias or using our lenses in a way that threatens the outcome of the search. And so really working with committees to make sure they're well trained and that they've done implicit bias training, and making sure that we're providing appropriate institutional support. And at SIUE, that means that we work on the faculty side to ensure that every search has an equity advisor. So it's a non-voting member of the committee. The equity advisor program is run out of Dr. Harris's office. It's part of the Impact Academy. It really is an outgrowth of our advanced grant, but they are people who are well-trained, faculty members who are well-trained in supporting best practices in searches, right? They're not there to police the search, but they're there to help the search committee work through difficult situations, navigate complex terrain, and make sure that they're doing everything that they can to yield a diverse and excellent search process. To me, the work has to begin in the recruitment process. That's where you really ask the questions about, do we have a robust pool? Does it reflect the availability of the, what do we know about the availability of the pool? Have we done everything that we can to leverage every resource possible to make sure that we've built the best pool possible? Because to me, that's where you intervene. You either build a more robust pool, build a more diverse pool. But then as you go, right, we're getting lots of input, and it's important that committees use rubrics. And I know that people don't like to talk about rubrics, but it's important, because if they talk about and agree on the qualifications and match those to the job description, and then work with fidelity, right? They come to consensus about what that construct means, and then they work with fidelity to ensure that everyone's using the same tool, then I think we get fairer processes, and we avoid what I've seen happen in search committees as a faculty member, where, right, we're talking about the requirements of the job, and then suddenly it's like the job shifts. But we want to avoid that job description shifting. We want to avoid the requirements shifting. And I think rubrics help people stay aligned with, this is what we said we were interested in hiring. These are the requirements. These are the characteristics. And then I do think sometimes we forget that candidates are interviewing us as well. right? They want to make sure that this is a place that they can thrive. And so when we get to the end, I hope that we've done everything we can to show them that this is a place where they can thrive. And I'm really interested in candidates who will help us advance our mission, who are committed to students, who understand the kind of institution we are and the institution we want to be, and who will feel purposeful in their work here. And you know, when you get to the end, all of the candidates are qualified. And so it's really thinking about who has the capacity to help you advance your mission and will feel purposeful in that and will enhance the excellence of your institution. As I've been rolling out our strategic plan, every time I talk about Pillar 3, which is about an excellent and diverse faculty and staff, I feel this need to pause and remind people, or at least convey to people, that I don't believe as an institution of higher education that we can achieve excellence without making sure we're fully addressing diversity and inclusion. So I think our searches are critical to that, and process is really what gets us to the outcome of the candidate we're looking for, but making sure that people can believe in that process, that they're well equipped and that they have all the support that they need from the institution. I see that as my job.
Thank you, Provost Cobb. And we'll actually talk about even why that diversity is important to our mission as we try to advance and move forward at the college. And Ms. Smith, if you can actually respond to the same question as far as what makes a successful search process, specifically as it relates to staff members, again, considering the needs of your hiring process, how you rate candidates, and how does SIU School of Medicine culture fit into the hiring process?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Caldwell. I'd first like to say I'd like to take Dr. Cobb with me to all of the trainings moving forward based on everything she just said. So thank you so much for that, because that's exactly from an HR perspective what we're trying to instill in our hiring managers and our leadership teams. And so I'm really grateful that that is how you lead. She's exactly right. We kind of mirror what she said regarding the process and training. Staff and civil service in particular is a little different than faculty searches. We have a screening process that happens at the Human Resources Office before they get to the interview committees or the search panel. So it's a little bit different than a faculty search. But we do the same thing. We ensure that our interview panels need to be well trained on how to interview. We need to think about the implicit bias training, which is something that we're implementing across our organization. So it's going to take a little bit of time, but we're ensuring that all of our hiring managers, all of our leaders, anyone who is involved in the hiring process has gone through some sort of interview and selection training and implicit bias training. So the standardization and the rubrics, that's something since we've been working on, particularly here at School of Medicine and as a system, about having a rubric that shifts away from this idea of that they're a good team fit, if you will. We keep asking and challenging our interview panels to think about, what are you trying to fit people into, right? So whenever someone comes to me as an HR person and says they were just a good fit for my team, I will challenge back, what are you trying to fit them into? Because what we should try to be fitting people into, which I know we'll talk later, is about having a workforce that represents our community. And so that's what we need to be trying to fit into, not necessarily what our current status is and our current state is. I would say the other biggest thing that we're trying to train and create this environment is the psychological safety. We talk a lot about psychological safety, but I think it's really critical in interview panels and search committees, because undoubtedly there are, power dynamics that exist in interview panels and search committees. And so it's really important for everyone to have a voice at the table when you're evaluating candidates, when you're reviewing their skill sets, when you're developing interview questions, in every stage of the process. A small anecdote, it was a staff search that we just did here in my office, and I had some fairly new staff members, and we were able to debrief and talk about the biases that we actually each brought to the table. So it's this idea that biases aren't necessarily bad. It's about what you do with biases that you have and how that impacts your decision making. And so being able to talk about that in a very safe space and be able to challenge one another we feel as though at the end of that search, we were able to hire the most qualified candidate for the particular position that we were searching for. And then I would say the diverse interview panel. I think that the diverse interview panel, we need to focus not just on having a person of color at the table, right? So diversity means so much more than a person of color, right? So we need to be thinking about the position that we're hiring and what the diversity of the interview panel looks like. Diversity shows up in many different ways, and we have an obligation and a responsibility to ensure that we are seeking out the most qualified diverse candidates. And so I think all of that being said, and then again, just to echo everything that Dr. Cobb said about, the job ad and making sure that it's written in an inclusive way that invites diverse candidates to the table to even apply, because many times we're not even seeing them even apply, much less get through the screening or the interview process. So it's how do we seek out the diverse candidate pool?
Thank you. Thank you both for those responses, Provost Cobb and Ms. Smith. And actually, for those of us who may be taking notes, you really actually went through and really talked to us about how to operationalize an inclusive hiring process. So I really appreciate that feedback. And now to Dr. Frazier for question 2. I know that you've actually hired several individuals in your department as you serve as the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Carbondale campus. So if you could just share with us and our audience today, what factors do you screen for and do you look for when hiring candidates?
Well, I think as far as screening, we want the very best candidates. And so that notion that we're trying to meet quotas or trying to ensure that we have faculty of color, that is truly a myth. I think to improve upon that, we want to have a broader search, and we want to be intentional about where we advertise jobs and where we look for fresh talent. Are we looking, and my question is, are we looking at HSIs, MSIs, or HBCUs to harvest new talent? And are there places where we need to be advertising that haven't? Are there conferences that we need to attend that we haven't, and so that we could get our jobs on the job board or actually do some tabling at those events? And so we're really trying to be strategic about that. The myth that always concerns me is that we can't find anyone. So my question is, then where are you looking? And some positions, you're absolutely right. There is going to be a limited pool of applicants. But then there's also, as you think about how your faculty and staff is structured, there's going to be a limited pool of diverse individuals that can serve on those committees. And so you want to burn them out, or individuals end up serving on 14 search committees. And really the way it's done at least at SIUC is that those committees are advisory committee and move the top candidates forward to meet with constituency groups, to meet with faculty senate, staff senate, and then eventually meet with the chancellor's cabinet as well. The thing that's interesting to me is how civil servants are hired in the state, because you may not know who those individuals are, right? So they pick them for you, and that concerns me, because it's usually somebody revealing those applicant pool, but may not necessarily know what you need, particularly if it's a student serving position. And so you know exactly what you need to be able to interact with those students. And so that concerns me a little, that we don't have more of an active role in that process.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Frazier. And just a couple of things I appreciate you mentioning is that student-centeredness is, I heard you speak about that, and then also just take into account I heard you use the word burnout for the faculty. And again, if we can go back to our comments, we saw that when you have a smaller number of faculty and staff members, that they basically carry the emotional and invisible labor of having to serve on multiple search committees. And so we do want to be able to spread that work out. So thank you for highlighting that. And also, I'm going to refer the same question to Dr. Mahoney. What factors do you screen for when hiring? And I know, again, you've hired several key leaders, including both of our chancellors, and made historic precedents as you've done so. So if you could share about what factors that you consider when hiring Chancellor Lane, Chancellor Minor, and others.
Yeah, and I'll start with following up with Dr. Frazier said. I mean, I am looking for the best candidate. I know I've never run a search where I didn't hire the person I thought was the best candidate at the end of the day. And to his point and to the point I think that Dr. Cobb and others said, some of this starts with the recruitment process. I always believe in very aggressive recruitment. I think our philosophy some places has been kind of build it and they will come, write a job ad and they will all apply, and you don't need to be aggressive. I'm a big believer on get on the phone, email people, try to get the word out and try to encourage people to apply. This is particularly true for female candidates. We were talking about this earlier. I was at a presentation of lawmakers once, and they said that the average female candidate has to be asked 5 times before she's willing to run. The average male candidate has to be asked 0 times. So that difference we know, and again, I've been doing a lot of searches over the years, as you said, at the leadership level. I can only think of one where we had over 50% were female candidates. Almost all, and in many cases, it was 70, 80% male. And so knowing that means we have to begin to be more aggressive at the beginning. So once we get that pool of candidates, what am I looking for? And let me say 2 things I'm not necessarily looking for. Years of experience. In a lot of our comments in the campus climate survey, they said we passed over somebody because they're more qualified candidate. And I'm not sure what they were classifying the more qualified candidate, but if I read the comments closely, sometimes it's, well, they've been doing the job for longer. My question is, have they been doing the job well for longer? I'd rather have somebody who's done the job for 5 years as opposed to 20 if they've done an outstanding job and really improved the area in 5 years compared to someone who did a decent job for 20 years. So again, the number of years of experience doesn't weigh as much as really what that experience amounted to. The other is that they've done that specific job before. We had this experience when I was doing a dean search once where the committee was committed that it had to be somebody who had been a dean before. They did not want anybody who was learning on the job. They had all these reasons why. At the end of the day, the candidate we all more or less agreed on, she had never been a dean before. But she was clearly the best candidate for the job, and she's been doing it for 10 years now and done an outstanding job. So we get caught up sometimes that they've done this specific job before, and that, again, is not in the position description. So get back to what we talked about earlier. I go back to the position description, which really is both a position profile, often we're talking leadership positions, both of what's expected in the role, but really a little bit of where we are as an institution and what we're looking for this person to do. So in some cases, and I'll take advancement as an example, you may have an area at some institution where you're Stanford and you're raising millions and millions of dollars every year. You're looking for somebody to maintain that level of success. In other places, you're at the ground level and you're looking for somebody to build. Those are 2 different types of experiences. So I'm looking for someone whose experiences matches kind of where we are, and again, has the right experience to do the job well. And I always say they should know their area much better than I do. So I'm looking for someone who really will be the one who will kind of set that direction in that particular area. So they have to have some leadership ability as well. So they're not just managers, but they're leaders and willing to and able to set that direction. Looking for natural collaborators. So people who work well with others. This was particularly true when hiring deans. We didn't want people who would be creating their own little fiefdom over there. We want somebody who's going to work well with the other deans, work well with the other administrators. Same thing is true with vice presidents, chancellors, whatever it is. We want people who work well together. Somebody who's aligned with the mission and direction of the institution. Again, if they're defining success differently than we are, that's going to be a problem. I always use the athletic director as an example. If we think graduating our student athletes is the highest priority and they think winning is the highest priority, we're going to have a problem from the very beginning. So they have to kind of be aligned with where we're headed. That being said, I'm not looking for a yes person. I want someone who will come in with their own ideas. So we should have a general agreement on where we're going, but how we get there, that's where I'm looking for someone who brings new ideas, different experiences you might be able to contribute to the overall team. So that's kind of the type of things that I know at least I have been looking for in searches that I've done in the past.
Thank you, Dr. Mahoney. That was a very helpful and clarifying list. And I think we now have more clarity as far as what are some of the myths that might be perceived and what's actual fact as far as what is looked for when we're looking at the most qualified applicants. And along that line, I actually want to talk a little bit more about that as we talk about myths of the most qualified applicant. Dr. Mahoney shared earlier about how, again, there's this overarching sentiment that if you're a white male, if you're of the majority population, that you may not have access to opportunities. But what are some of the other myths that you know about as far as the hiring process? I heard Dr. Frazier talk about how we can't find certain applicants, and we heard Dr. Mahoney and Dr. Frazier speak to, again, where are you looking, and just really being intentional and strategic when you're trying to find women and people of color, because again, those groups are not as prevalent in some of our positions across the campuses. So what are some of the myths or misconceptions about the hiring process? And Ms. Smith, I'm going to start with you on that particular question.
Sure, thank you. I think that, you know, you've spoken to a little bit of it about the myths of hiring. I think that we've talked about our process a little bit, that I think there's this idea that there's one person in the background, you know, choosing the candidate. We've demonstrated here with this discussion so far that we as an SIU system are working hard toward developing a process that has a high level and high degree of integrity throughout the entire process. So it starts with the operational needs of the position description and what is needed, and then there's a search committee, and then the interview panel, all the way through, and then the training that goes along with that. So I think this idea that there's one particular person or it's about who you know, I think these processes and focusing on the process and upholding that integrity will help us overcome that and demonstrate that we really are trying to hire the most qualified candidates for the position regardless. I would say that, you know, to speak to a couple of other things, you know, I think that Dr. Frazier mentioned about the civil service process, and I definitely think that's a challenge that we face as a state university. However, I do think that the civil service system is moving toward, you know, some of the movement that we're looking at, such as moving away from computer-based testing. So computer-based testing was a huge barrier to access. And so you would see someone on paper who looks, you know, extremely qualified based on the education experience, you know, what they bring to the table. However, they would, you know, get stuck in the computer-based testing, which was actually not really relevant to some of the work that was being done. So by the end of December of this year, I think they're moving completely away from the computer-based testing for all civil service positions, which I think will gain us a very an opportunity to evaluate candidates based on what we're looking for the position. So I'm excited about that shift as a state university that has been a challenge for years. Yeah, I think I can't think of any other myths right now that if there was anything particular that we were speaking of. I think we've covered many of them so far during this conversation, but happy to loop back around.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Dr. Mahoney, as we, again, I know you're very familiar with the data, can you maybe provide some insight into why there is a misconception about who's being hired compared to the actual facts that you presented? Do you have any thoughts or comments about why there's such a strong misalignment between who's here compared to opportunity for hiring? If you could share about that.
Yeah, that's always a hard one to answer, why other people perceive things the way they do. I think, and again, this is not all unique to SIU, is, as I mentioned earlier, there has been some change. So I think even when there is a modest change from what has been typically the case, people have this tendency to believe that it's a massive change. And so I often talk about it. I teach about sports. Like you look at the integration of Major League Baseball, and people would talk about, you know, baseball in the 1950s, how diverse it was. If you look at the numbers, it was not at all diverse. It was still overwhelmingly white. And there were teams like the Yankees that were still entirely white. But because it was so much more than when the period when it was all white back in the 1940s, we have this perception that there's a huge increase in people of color in Major League Baseball, and that just wasn't the case. And so I think that's some of what we see in our data too, is, again, we're comparing it to the past. And we often do that with almost everything. We compare it to what it once was. And that's our kind of standard of what it was when I got here type of thing. And then when it changes from that, I think it's different. I think there's also a perception or misconception sometimes about the search process itself and how much maybe certain people were influencing that. I can say for most of the, again, senior level searches I've been involved with, when we get down to the point of, all right, we've gone through the first round of interviews and rank order your top 4 candidates, I think people outside of that room would be shocked how consistent it usually is. That overwhelmingly, I mean, there's been several searches where I usually take part in it too, and I come in 15 minutes after they start, and they tell me who their top 4 is, and it's my top 4, and we're done in 15 minutes because there was general agreement. And again, I think back to some of the good practices other people have talked about on this panel, there was general agreement about that alignment. But I've heard from other people that so-and-so actually influenced and made sure this person was in there. And I was like, well, that's not at all true. There's 26 people in that room who were in general agreement on that person being a finalist. So I think that's a misperception. I think the other thing I sometimes hear too is you didn't listen to me. And I had this happen actually with one leader one time when we were doing a search, and he said, I guess you didn't listen to me because I hired the person he didn't like. And I was like, well, I did, but I also heard from 30, 40, 50, 60 other people, and your view was just not aligned with most of them. And so I was actually listening to a lot of feedback from a lot of people, but it doesn't mean that who we hire is always going to be aligned with who you thought was the best. And sometimes who you thought was the best is based sometimes on criteria. And this is a problem we sometimes have, is they emphasize one criteria from the position description, and that's the thing they think is most important. Or even in a few cases, a criteria that was not at all in the position description, but they've decided that the person has to have X. And in their mind, that's the thing that drives everything else. And so they're just out of line with other people. But again, we do very much listen to the feedback, and it does have an influence. It's just not always, again, it may not be your input that has the rules of the day.
Thank you for that. A lot of good, rich feedback there as you talked about some of the myths. One of the things, as we looked at about maybe 7 pages of comments, we probably could have got up to probably, I would say, close to 12 if we just really extracted more and more comments from the data. So one of the things that was also evident to me about myths is that I would have expected to see more feedback saying that this person of color was hired, and this is maybe where they're lacking compared to someone else who got the position. But if you recall the comments that I read, the majority of the comments basically imply that because a person of color or a woman was getting selected for a position, that somehow that they were not the most qualified. And so as we think about that, that is one of the myths. And then again, it goes back to your point, Dr. Mahoney, that sometimes when we look at what the status quo, even a slight disruption to that status quo can sometimes disorient people or make them feel like maybe the opportunities are not equally available to everyone. But that's something that I think that we should think about as far as, again, as we think about race relations and having maybe a certain deficit-based mindset, inferior mindset about certain individuals. That's something that we should probably have some self-reflection about, because again, the comments did not show how people were lacking and how they were not qualified. Just the fact that they were a person of color, that somehow that was the suggestion that they were not qualified for those positions. And we've heard from our president, provost, executive director of human resources, as well as Dr. Frazier, and they've all hired individuals, and they've all been very consistent about a search process and about several processes that take place to ensure that there is some type of agreement. Again, as we heard with Dr. Mahoney, he's listening to broad feedback and making decisions off of that broad feedback, and that is again the case. So I want us to think about how people are being hired in these processes, and how, again, we don't want to automatically assume that somebody is a token or an affirmative action hire because they are a person of color. So as we think about moving from a deficit-based mindset to an asset-based mindset, I'm going to ask Dr. Frazier, our Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, what strategies do you use to attract diverse talent? When you think about job descriptions, diverse publications, you talked earlier about being strategic and deliberate. What are some of the strategies you think are optimal when trying to recruit the best qualified diverse applicants?
Well, I think the first part of when the hiring process should typically is developing the position description. And so we've all had to write position descriptions. And so you can write the description for who you want, but oftentimes it's written for who you don't want to apply. And which causes, you know, you end up with the same individuals that you've previously hired. And so one of the things we try to look at the description in depth to ensure that we have a diverse pool. And so part of that process here is making sure that affirmative action looks through the position description. And she and I will go back and forth along with the hiring manager to ensure that that position description is written so that it allows for a diverse pool to be able to apply. Yeah, and you start that with, of course, everyone has done this, but you start that with the very minimum that someone would need, and then be very diverse and detail orient in what the maximum that you may need to fill that vacancy. And so I think that's the initial strategy, but I'm gonna go back to being intentional about how the process is, that you have some checks and balances as you move along. Okay, has the search committee met? Is there metrics for how you move the candidates forward? Sometimes we have searches where there's no metrics, and it's almost like a straw poll on who's the best, and that doesn't necessarily guarantee you the best candidate. And then making sure that they're before several different groups, particularly if that individual is going to serve in a role where they have to be interactive and collaborate with different groups. Everyone needs to have at least a conversation with them as they move forward through the process. And I know with certain roles, I heard you talk earlier about the processes on how many people you might have to be before, but that also ensures that the person that you hired, everyone had a voice in it or had an opportunity to have a voice in who that individual was. So that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, we've all hired and person did great in the interview, and once the work started, they couldn't do the work to the quality that you needed that. So that part is a hit and miss, but making sure that you have the best candidate through the interview process. I'm of the opinion that we need to have as many people as possible, including some student voices in there, to move those candidates forward.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I agree. Again, talked about just making sure that we have kind of exhausted resources to at least have that diverse applicant pool and look at the qualifications and make sure that we're including our voices. So thank you for that. Before we go to our last two questions, I just want to remind our audience who's joined us today is to submit your questions to the chat or email them to doriswilliams@siu.edu. And so our next question for Provost Cobb, if you could share about what are some of the challenges that you have received in the past as it relates to hiring decisions, if you could share about that.
So I'd say when you're hiring high-level positions, it's impossible, well, maybe not impossible. It's unlikely that everyone will agree. As Dr. Mahoney suggested earlier, you're gathering input from a lot of people. And while there may be coherence around the finalist, the final choice, often there's variability, right? Because you have really talented people. And so, you know, I've had situations where I've hired internal candidates to people's displeasure. I've hired external candidates to people's displeasure, right? But also people are excited about both of those, right? There's not usually unanimity around a particular candidate. And so I think for me, as I've stressed, like the process is really important in making sure that people trust the process so that they can trust the outcome, right? I think a lot about procedural justice, and I think that people can trust an outcome if they believe that the processes were fair and equitable and made sense, right? And so I think that's why I emphasize process so much, is because I think it really matters to get people to accept an outcome that they might not have chosen themselves, right? And sometimes, you know, I might be more excited about a candidate who would be a little disruptive because we're trying to move on a particular issue, right? But that's disconcerting to people, even though they're excited. And so I think there are often complicated dynamics. And so I'd love to say every choice I've ever made, people thought was wise and judicious, but you know, that just isn't the case. And so I really tried to do my best to help people understand who I am, believe that they understand my values and how they align with the university's goals and mission, and understand that we've done our best to build processes that support equitable and inclusive searches. I do think I'd like for everyone to scrutinize the searches that we do. I don't have any problem with that, right? But I hope that in the end, they can trust the outcome and not just apply that level of scrutiny to, you know, the woman who is selected or the person of color who is selected for the position. I'd like to make sure that we're not diminishing the qualifications of our candidates, and focusing on an identity attribute that is not the central part of who that person is or what they will contribute necessarily, right? As a candidate, it is part of who they are, part of what they bring to the table, not the sum total. And I think some of the comments, I understand the backlash and the concern, but I hope that we can build processes that people begin to trust and see the outcomes of our searches differently and the processes of searches differently. I just want to circle back to the previous question, if you don't mind. One of the things I'd like to see more of is kind of continuous recruitment. I think on the faculty side, we have opportunities to recruit all the time. Every time someone goes to a conference, they have the opportunity to meet people, share the story of SIUE and the SIU system. They have an opportunity to talk about who we are. They have an opportunity, I hope, that they could come back and talk to their dean, or they could talk to me, or they could talk to someone else and see, could we bring that person to do a talk for our students? Could we bring them in to do a workshop with our faculty, right? And so then more people know about who we are, because otherwise, if we just rely on our own networks, those tend to be homophilous with people like ourselves, right? So we have to intentionally reach out to more people and spread that story of who we are and be in constant recruitment mode. So I apologize for going back. I just wanted to add that to the mix, if that's okay.
Oh, no, that's an excellent point. Always recruit. I agree with that. And like you said, that's how we get the network of quality applicants that we need. And it's a very proactive, again, we've heard proactive, strategic, deliberate. So I appreciate you adding that aspect. And I'm going to ask the same question to Dr. Frazier. If you think about some of the challenges that has been imposed regarding the hiring decisions, I think it would be helpful. And one of the things I want to say prior to that, as we talk about a lot of the comments, Dr. Cobb made a great point, is that as people do search committees, we don't have anything to hide. It would be interesting if people had concerns that they would go to the search committee chair and maybe ask those questions and really unpack why certain candidates were selected over others in a way, obviously, that doesn't violate any confidences or laws, but that again, as we can be transparent, we can share that information. But we know that there have been challenges again, regarding hiring decisions. And Dr. Frazier, if you can share about your experiences with that.
Well, I would agree with Dr. Cobb that sometimes it can be hit and miss, and if you are trying to please everyone, let me know how that works, because I want a copy of that book, because that's that's going to be a very, very difficult task. But I think as we look at both of or all three of our strategic plans, and we talk about our most important clients and our students, Are we doing things that are student-centered? Are we doing things and making decisions that are going to be able to advance staff and possibly advance faculty? And if those decisions, if you can say yes to all three of those, then it's probably the best decision. And so that's just Paul Frazier. Now, not everyone does that but oftentimes it has been my experience that whether I was in public aid or higher ed, we make those decisions not based being student centered. We based it on the individuals we're hiring, and that typically in the long run is not the best suited way to fulfill those vacancies. And I'm trying to be politically correct because it's Tuesday. Ordinarily, ask me that question on Thursday, it'll be different.
Yeah, you make a great point. I think sometimes it is, who do I want to go to lunch with, you know? More so than who you want to, who will be the best in front of the students. So I think that's a great point. With that, I actually, as we talked a lot about myths, I want us to end before we actually transition to questions, for us to just freely share about our experiences as well as our convictions about why is it important to have an inclusive hiring process that attracts mission-driven candidates to SIU. Again, that's what we want, people who believe in our mission, who wants to advance the college, who wants to serve students well. That's our focus. Anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all those things that we've committed to, being an outstanding, accessible, affordable institution that delivers a high quality education in our region, in our 66 counties. Why is it important that we have an inclusive hiring process that supports all of those missions? And I'm going to start with our president, Dr. Dan Mahoney.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. If I'm looking at particularly at the leadership role, which is usually where I'm hiring, I think we make better decisions when we have a more diverse group of leaders, and we don't have a more diverse group of leaders if we don't have a diverse search processes and kind of developing that. I think when we're all have similar backgrounds and similar experiences, we probably have a lot more blind spots and we'll make a lot more mistakes in that process. I think it's also important for our students, again, to see themselves reflected in who's leading the institution, whether you're talking about from a gender or race perspective. So I think there's a lot of reasons why that is important. And certainly when we're talking about faculty and staff, there's actually quite a bit of research out there that talks about the impact of diverse faculty and staff on student success. So if our goal really is, and that's I think our ultimate goal as any institution, is to increase student success, then diversity in hiring is actually one of the critically important things to being successful. So I think there's a lot of reasons for that being an important goal for us.
Thank you for that. Dr. Cobb, same question. Why is it important to have an inclusive hiring process?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we know that diverse teams may identify problems differently, right? They may identify things as problems that other people can't even see without diverse membership on that team, right? We can identify alternative solutions. I really do believe that learning is enhanced when we have diverse perspectives in the classroom, diverse experiences and diverse backgrounds coming to bear to really think about problem solving differently and I think you get more creativity and more possibilities for innovation. And when I think about the type of institution we are, we want to contribute to the public good. We want to make a difference in our communities. We want to help cultivate leaders who will be change makers. If they are going to be able to, if our students are going to graduate and be able to make a difference in the world, they need to have been in an environment where all the things that I just named were real and possible and part of their educational experience, so that they're prepared to collaborate and to think critically and to really engage in problem solving in a way that helps advance our society and to create a better world. I mean, I know that sounds trite, but I really do believe that that's what we're trying to do, is prepare students for that next stage. And I don't think we can do that without intentionality in hiring, making sure we have student-centered faculty and staff, as Dr. Frazier and others have suggested, and making sure I want faculty who want to be here at this kind of institution. And often people will say, well, we won't get blank fill in the blank, to come here. They won't come here, whoever they might be, right? And it switches depending on the conversation. And I just disagree. I think that there are incredibly talented people who want to be at an institution exactly like ours, or exactly like SIU Carbondale, or exactly like the School of Medicine, because they believe it fits with their values and aligns with their purpose and the contributions they want to make. We just have to invest the time in reaching out and bringing them into our circle so that they know this is what they could accomplish here. So maybe that's overly optimistic, but it helps bring me to work each day. And I think I also think it aligns with our strategic plan. I think it aligns well with the SIU system strategic plan. And I think it's quite frankly what the public should expect of us as a state institution.
Absolutely. Thank you, Provost Scott. I think it's definitely a worthy goal. And like you said, we're all, striving for those goals that you outlined. And we do want our students to be prepared, and we want everyone who is a part of the SIU community to thrive and flourish. So thank you for sharing that. Ms. Smith, same question as far as inclusive processes and what you look for in the School of Medicine.
Great, thank you. So I would say, the bottom line, like we've said before, we have a responsibility, an opportunity, and an obligation to develop and grow a workforce that represents the people that we serve, whether that be, students, patients, other staff. I think the other thing that gets lost sometimes is our current staff, when we talk about retention. If we do not continue to grow as an organization and continue to bring on diverse workforce, the current people who are here will not be able to grow either. So grow in their ideas, grow in their thought processes, and everything along with that. I think in order to be a competitive organization and to avoid being stagnant, we have to take the action. When I think about, being a diverse organization, when I think about being an anti-racism institution, that requires us to take action on our part. And so that action shows up in many different ways. But I think that, we just need to continue to build that aspiration university and organization where students want to come, where patients want to come, where employees want to come. And we do that through telling our story and continuing to move forward. And so being able to foster that. I wanted to say one more opportunity is when we think about the intentionality of it, is providing pathway programs and access. So, Dr. Caldwell, you had asked me to give a little bit of a story. We are trying to identify our frontline clinical workers, for example, and there is a shortage of frontline clinical workforce in this area. We've got 3 of the biggest healthcare providers in this area, in addition to us, and so there is definitely a shortage. And so we are, challenged by our footprint here. And so what we have done is then we're taking it a step further and developing partnerships at the high school level, right? So, we have partnerships at the higher education level when people are graduating from, college, but we have not done as much work in the high school level. And so we've got a couple of budding partnerships here in the Springfield office, at least with the high schools, to try to develop those pathways and pipeline programs to have access to people earlier on. So.
Oh, thank you for sharing about that partnership and pipeline program, and even specifically just saying building with intentionality. And then also I heard just forecasting. When we think about our workforce, Dr. Cobb talked about always recruiting, and it's like, again, you're looking down the line. It's like we have to be very intentional, right? Deliberate and strategic if we're going to build well, and if we're going to build in a way that we can attract the most highly qualified applicants to SIU. Dr. Paul Frazier, same question.
So I agree with both you ladies, but I'm going to add this to that. Commitment, and I heard this somewhere else. Commitment without compensation is counterfeit, and not nearly monetarily, but you got to commit to advancing careers, because you may not be always be able to pay them. Well, are we committed to advancing those individuals from a professional development standpoint? Are we mentoring them And that's why I'm a fan of hiring in cohorts. So not only do you get the mentoring in a particular college, but that group of individuals get to mentor each other and kind of work through the process, whether it's tenured or non-tenured, whether it's staff or whatever, that we hire in cohorts. And so that's the selling point, that we might not be able to pay you the amount of money, but you're going to be able to grow. And although we don't want to lose good talent, I would rather lose talent saying I left and I was able to do X because I got this and I got this at SIUC than leaving and having some disparaging things to say about the institution. Now I don't own what I just said, because y'all can use that quote, y'all can put it on Twitter or Instagram, wherever y'all want to do, ladies. Feel free to use it. but I think we got to live by that to keep good talent and recruit good talent.
Thank you. Commitment without compensation is counterfeit, right? Thank you. That's a good one. With that. So what I would like to do now is that we do have one question for the audience, and it actually went specifically was related to writing job descriptions. And actually this was directed to panelists, Dr. Frazier as well. Is there checks and balances to ensure that there are inclusive wording included? I'm reading the exact comment, but the attendee is asking about inclusive wording in job descriptions, and how do we ensure that we do that well?
Now, I would say that that's something that we're working really hard on doing, because that hadn't been a practice. I want to be transparent about that. That's something we're working really hard on doing. And being transparent about what the job is, what it includes, what the compensation is going to be. And then putting the onus on the applicants as well, and have them write a diversity statement. What's your diversity statement?
That is definitely becoming more and more common in higher ed. So thank you for sharing that as a high impact practice as well. I would like to ask other panelists about inclusive wording and other high impact practices that you see in the inclusive hiring process. Some of the other things that you may include.
I think one of the things, and we probably have talked about this some, but having diversity advocates on committees, I think helps. Again, bias training helps some, but even after that, I've had people who seem to have not learned anything from that process, but having someone there who's identifying when someone is doing that. I've served on committees where people were really good about pointing out what you just did there is you kind of underestimate this candidate because of X or Y. And we know there's lots of ways. We were sharing the story earlier. I was in a search one time, and I made it to the next round, but they said that the problem was they didn't know if you actually achieved anything. And I was like, what do you mean? I talked about all of the things we accomplished. And they said, well, you kept saying we, you never said I. And generally female candidates do that, but male candidates don't. And so next time say I more. And I said, well, that's really kind of stupid that I have to change my wording in order for you to understand that. But anyways, I tried to do that, but it also had me then think about every search I've done since then, looking for that, particularly in any candidate, but particularly female candidates who tend to be sometimes downgraded because people don't give them credit because they don't take credit quite the way that the male candidates do. And so there's lots of those little things that we need to think about throughout the process to make sure, again, we're not introducing bias after we get that candidate pool and we're going through the interviews.
No, thank you for sharing that example, and even the committee noticing that and actually giving you that feedback. And I think the reason why that's helpful is because we actually can see, as we've listened to really all of the individuals who are here before you, this is what they do. They hire multiple times a year. And you could actually see this process is not for someone who's unskilled or for the faint of heart. It is a lot of things to consider, and it's a lot of things to unpack to be able to know, well, female candidates are likely to say we. So now maybe I need to unpack or do follow-up questions to make sure I actually understand more particularly what that skill set is, and to also understand that male applicants are more likely to use I, and maybe even probe them to see what type of collaborative efforts that they have had to engage in at their institution. Those are the things that, again, takes a certain skill set and knowledge about where the biases come in, and again, also how we just move and function in society. So that was an excellent example. I think at this time we may have one more question, and if we can address this, and Ms. Smith, I'm going to go to you because we had this conversation earlier. Again, as we talk about a certain suggestion that, again, a person of color is being hired because they're a person of color, and even how sometimes that mindset negatively impacts the person or the woman who's being hired. So can you share about tokenism, and again, how we want to make sure that we're not only hiring people, again, based on skin color, and we saw that connotation again in the comments, if you could share about that.
Yes, absolutely. I've had some recent conversations about how if a person of color, this idea that we're going to hire just based on a quota is actually, it can be offensive or insulting for us to hire candidates who are less qualified just because of the color of their skin or because of their minority status. And so, again, we have that. It's irresponsible of us, I believe, as an organization to only use that as a factor, right? It is our obligation to seek out a diverse, qualified pool. So just the idea of trying to meet some sort of quota. So I think, the system, SIU system as a whole, we have a team of individuals who are focused on avoiding this, right? So we're talking about education and about what we need to do to seek out diverse candidates, not just to meet quotas. It can actually put minorities or at a disadvantage if they are hired and they're less qualified for whatever reason, and then the job performance reflects that. So it actually creates more of an issue than taking the time to spend some time on the front end of hiring and thinking about our operational needs, and then seeking out candidates and having that access to our positions and to our organization.
That was very helpful, and I'm glad, obviously, again, in your role, that you've been able to establish those type of relationships and build trust, where people feel comfortable saying, "Hey, I'm not pleased with the fact that people are perceiving me as only obtaining this role because of gender and skin color. It really is because of my skill set." And one of the things I would like to share that actually dawned on me as you was making your comments, which can really be a disconnect, is that oftentimes if you ask people of color, and I think it was true in my generation, and I heard it a lot, especially from the older generation, it was this notion that you had to work twice as hard to be perceived as half as good. So I think about how, some groups might think, oh, you're getting a job based on color, and other groups think, well, I really had to, do a lot. I was actually, as we talk about stories, just 2 days ago, actually, I would say this past Friday, talking to an employee who specifically told me that they've been here for a while. And they said when they looked at the promotion and tenure requirements, they had already accepted that as a person of color and as a woman, that there was absolutely no way that they could follow those tenure requirements and get tenure. And what they meant by that is, if you ask for 3 publications, I need 5. If you want this amount of hours of service, I need to get at least 30 to 50% of that. And again, that notion still holds true today with a lot of faculty. They may say, well, this person was able to receive promotion and tenure. But when I talk to, even today, to faculty from different ethnic backgrounds, they will share that whatever those standards are, they know that those standards, that they have to go well above that, again, to pass that level of scrutiny, because they believe that, again, based on bias and racism and stereotypes and discrimination, that if they don't go above that particular bar, that they will not, again, get the same promotion and tenure. With those minimum standards. And so I just wanted to share that it's a disconnect between how people are being perceived, and again, with minoritized populations knowing that they have to work harder, again, to be perceived as, sufficient and adequate. The last thing I would actually like to say, and again, we're in an educational environment, and it's worthwhile knowing that if we go back and if we look at the history of affirmative action and quotas, and I think about a lot of the cases that Thurgood Marshall won when he first started, fighting these cases in court, and specifically the Supreme Court. I want you all to follow me for a moment and imagine Thurgood Marshall going before white judges and saying, this Black applicant has less qualifications, but because they're Black, they should get into this particular institution. Affirmative action started because African-American candidates had way more qualifications than the minimum standards, and they were able to show that they were not getting in. PBS, you can actually go today and they have very short clips, 4 to 5 minutes, and they have recorded narratives from people of color, Latino, Asian, and African-American, specifically talking about their experiences with the workforce. And one story that comes to mind is an African-American woman who was a nurse. And she said back then they had quotas where they only had to let in 2 or 3 nurses. And she gave an example of how she had 100% on an assessment, but because they had already filled their quota, she was not able to get into the nursing field, even though she had a perfect score. And she knew of other women who had perfect scores on their assessments too. And so really when affirmative action and quotas started, the goal was you have to let qualified people in. It wasn't to let unqualified people in. And so what I'm also wanting to say is today, from a person of an ethnic or racialized background, they feel like that still holds true, that they have to be excellent and they have to do things well or they will not get in the door. So again, I just wanted to share that perspective as well, because it's not a good feeling to, you know, obtain these degrees and get these particular skills and then be told the only reason why you got this position is because of color and not because of your merit, not because of your intellectual capacity, not because of your service, your work ethic. And so again, we want to dignify. That's part of what we want to do on our campus is we want people to have dignified experiences. And it's very undignifying to have your colleagues or peers think that you're less than or you're less qualified, again, based on the color of your skin. So I just wanted to say that that would be a worthwhile thing to research and to see where that history came from. And again, it wasn't from unqualified individuals. It was for people who were more than qualified for the roles that they were applying for. Okay. And I am going to, do we have other questions? Dr. Mahoney, I'm gonna turn it over.
No, I was just going to say, it's interesting when you talk about that, Title IX has a very similar history. Title IX, what we often think about it related to athletics, sexual assault and other things, really was about educational opportunities. And it was because more qualified women were being passed over for less qualified men in college admissions processes. And that was really the primary push for Title IX back in the late 60s, early 70s when it passed in 1972. So very similar history.
Actually, thank you for sharing that alignment. But again, that history, you know, is compatible. And I think women may also say the same things, but sometimes they're subjected. It just depends to a certain level of scrutiny. So again, just things to consider as we have these dialogues. Again, we want to elevate and to have these engaging conversations. And for those of you who are in the audience today, SIU team members and others, thank you so much for joining us. I'm actually going to give a clap for our expert panelists. Thank you all for being here. And I invite you all and welcome you to join us on November 16th from 12 o'clock to 1:30 as we speak to free speech and diversity of thought. All right. Have a great day, SIU. Thank you all for being here.